Lesbian women are becoming emotionally harder to read. Not colder, not less caring, just harder to emotionally reach. And the terrifying part is that many of them genuinely believe this means they're healing. Because modern emotional numbness no longer looks tragic. It looks emotionally disciplined, calm, independent, self-aware, unreactive, like someone who finally learned their worth. But emotional shutdown often disguises itself as emotional growth after enough disappointment, especially after repeated emotional inconsistency, repeated almost relationships, repeated situationships that felt emotionally intimate, but structurally unstable. That changes the nervous system, quietly, over time. The brain stops asking, who feels emotionally safe, and starts asking, who feels least emotionally dangerous? That's a completely different way of loving. And modern lesbian dating culture accelerates this faster than people realize. Because emotional intimacy now develops inside unstable environments. Dating apps, validation economies, constant emotional accessibility, hypercommunication followed by sudden detachment, people becoming emotionally inseparable for 2 weeks, then emotionally disappearing without explanation. Modern relationships rarely collapse through one catastrophic betrayal anymore. They collapse through accumulated emotional confusion, mixed signals, emotional inconsistency, half-commitment, soft abandonment, and eventually, the body adapts. That's the part nobody warns you about. The human nervous system adapts to emotional instability so well that survival starts feeling normal. A woman who once over-explained her feelings now says nothing. A woman who once chased reassurance now pretends she doesn't need it. A woman who once wanted emotional depth now says she only wants peace. But sometimes peace is not peace. Sometimes it's emotional exhaustion wearing healthier language. That distinction matters a lot, because healing softens fear. Numbness suppresses feeling. Healing creates emotional flexibility. Numbness reduces emotional expectation. Healing allows vulnerability to feel safer again. Numbness simply convinces people vulnerability is no longer worth the emotional cost. And online, those two states look almost identical, especially now. Because the internet rewards emotional detachment. The less reactive you appear, the more emotionally evolved people assume you are. The woman who no longer double texts gets called secure. The woman who emotionally withdraws first gets called self-respecting. The woman who stops expressing needs gets praised for being low maintenance. But emotionally low-maintenance people are often just emotionally underfed people who stopped believing their needs would be handled gently. That's darker. Because eventually self-silencing becomes automatic. Not conscious. Automatic. A lot of lesbian women learned early that emotional intensity makes people uncomfortable. Too emotional. Too attached. Too sensitive. Too much. So they adapted. They softened their reactions, reduced their needs, edited their personalities, started monitoring how emotionally visible they appeared around others, especially around emotionally avoidant partners, especially inside modern dating culture where emotional availability is desired aesthetically, but often rejected practically. People want intimacy, until intimacy requires emotional responsibility. That contradiction is everywhere now. People crave deep connection, while structuring their lives around emotional escape routes. That's why so many relationships now feel emotionally close, but psychologically temporary. And lesbian women often internalize this instability differently. because emotional merging tends to happen fast. Fast vulnerability, fast attachment, fast emotional dependency. Two people becoming emotionally central to each other before trust has even fully formed. At first, that intensity feels magical. Then the instability starts. One person pulls away emotionally. Communication shifts. Affection fluctuates. Consistency disappears. And suddenly the other person starts emotionally scanning everything. Reply speed. Tone changes. Energy differences. Microsignals. Because once emotional inconsistency enters a relationship, hypervigilance usually follows. That's not insecurity. That's nervous system conditioning. The body starts preparing for abandonment before abandonment fully arrives. And after enough repetition, women stop calling it anxiety. They call it intuition. That's how emotional exhaustion evolves quietly. Not through dramatic breakdowns. Through constant emotional monitoring. Modern dating trains people to become emotional detectives, always searching for signs they're about to be replaced. And dating apps made this worse, because nobody feels emotionally irreplaceable anymore. People feel algorithmically disposable. One difficult conversation, one emotional misunderstanding, one period of emotional complexity, and there's another face waiting behind a screen. That awareness rewires attachment completely. Women start emotionally editing themselves in real time, trying to stay desirable without becoming emotionally inconvenient, trying to appear emotionally deep without appearing emotionally difficult, trying to communicate needs without sounding needy, trying to stay emotionally wanted without fully revealing how deeply they actually care. That balancing act destroys people internally. Because eventually, you stop knowing where your real emotional personality ends, and your survival personality begins. That's why so many women can't tell whether they're healing or just emotionally disappearing. Both experiences reduce emotional intensity, but only one reconnects you to yourself. The other disconnects you from your own emotional signals completely. And numbness can feel deceptively empowering at first. No overthinking, no panic, no emotional spirals, no attachment obsession, no desperate need for reassurance. Just distance, control, emotional quietness. But emotional silence is not always emotional peace. Sometimes it's what happens when the nervous system no longer believes emotional expression changes outcomes. That realization creates emotionally detached survival identities. Women who still crave intimacy deeply, but approach relationships like emotional risk management. Women who say they're protecting their peace, while internally preparing for abandonment every time they start liking someone. Women who appear emotionally composed, while secretly expecting emotional inconsistency from everyone. That expectation changes how people love. Quietly, without noticing, people stop fully attaching, stop fully trusting, stop fully revealing themselves. They become emotionally partial, half open, half expressive, half visible, trying to experience closeness without risking emotional devastation. But partial emotional presence creates another kind of loneliness entirely. The loneliness of being emotionally surrounded, while psychologically unreachable. And that loneliness is becoming incredibly common now, especially among emotionally intelligent women. Because emotional intelligence without emotional safety often becomes emotional self-surveillance. Every feeling gets analyzed. Every attachment reaction gets intellectualized. Every emotional wound becomes psychologically categorized. People understand themselves conceptually while still feeling emotionally disconnected internally. That's modern emotional culture. Emotionally educated, psychologically exhausted. And lesbian women often carry another layer rarely discussed openly. Emotional translation fatigue. The exhaustion of constantly calculating safety before emotional honesty. Reading rooms carefully. Adjusting language carefully. Monitoring reactions carefully. Trying to predict how emotionally accepted they'll be before revealing the full version of themselves. That level of self-monitoring fragments identity slowly, especially for women who spent years suppressing attraction, masking vulnerability, or emotionally reshaping themselves to survive socially. Eventually, constant self-editing becomes instinctive, and when that happens long enough, people lose access to spontaneous emotional expression. Everything becomes filtered, measured, managed, controlled, even love. That's why healing can become difficult to recognize, because real healing often feels emotionally unfamiliar at first. Healthy love doesn't create constant emotional guessing. It doesn't require hyperanalysis. It doesn't reward emotional performance. It doesn't force people into chronic self-monitoring. But nervous systems conditioned by instability sometimes interpret calmness as emotional absence, because chaos became associated with emotional intensity. That's another brutal contradiction inside modern relationships. People mistake unpredictability for passion, and mistake numbness for peace. Meanwhile, the nervous system is simply exhausted. Exhausted from emotional inconsistency. Exhausted from emotional ambiguity. Exhausted from trying to remain emotionally desirable inside systems built around emotional convenience. Because modern intimacy increasingly rewards emotional manageability over emotional depth. Deep-feeling people complicate convenience culture. They require patience, consistency, emotional accountability, and modern dating increasingly avoids all three. So people adapt by shrinking emotionally, not because they stopped caring, because caring started feeling psychologically unsafe. And eventually, survival starts masquerading as healing. Emotional suppression starts sounding like maturity. Emotional distance starts feeling safer than emotional hope. Until one day, a woman realizes she no longer knows whether she actually became stronger or simply became emotionally unreachable. That's the hidden psychology underneath modern numbness. Not coldness, not lack of love, just nervous systems slowly adapting to repeated emotional instability until emotional absence starts feeling normal. And the saddest part? A lot of women don't miss love anymore. They miss emotional safety, the ability to stop monitoring, stop preparing, stop self-editing, stop emotionally bracing for disappointment before intimacy even fully begins. Because the deepest human desire was never constant attention. It was emotional rest, a connection where vulnerability no longer feels dangerous. A relationship where the nervous system finally stops expecting emotional abandonment in advance. And many people haven't felt that in so long, they genuinely can't tell whether they're healing or simply becoming better at surviving emotional emptiness.